Welcome back everybody. In this video, we'll be showing you how to change a front tire, a rear tire, and both inner tubes on the Apollo Air Pro. The tools you'll need for this are up to 3 pry bars coated in electric tape, 1 ratchet with a 10mm socket, 1 4 and 2 6mm Allen keys, and 1 19mm wrench. Now the first thing we're going to do is remove this screw right here and this nut right here. We're going to start with our 10mm socket. I'm going to put that to the side and gently pull this off like this. We can then take a 4mm Allen key and unscrew the top screw. Last thing we want to do before removing the wheel is removing our brake line. So we're just going to pull up and push out. As you can see, our brake line is now free. Now we can go and loosen up our axle screws. What we're going to need for this is 2 6mm Allen keys, 1 on each side, and gently start unscrewing your axle. Once you feel one of the screws is loosen enough to remove, we can then hold our wheel while pulling out the axle, like this. Now we have 2 spacers, 1 on each side. We want to reach into the fork and remove both of them while holding the wheel, and the wheel should come free. Now that our wheel is out, we can first take out our drum brake. We will then flip the wheel over and remove all the air from the inner tube. For this, we can take a small Allen key or just a screw. Make sure we leave the least possible amount of air in the inner tube. That should do it. Now what we'll use to remove the tire will be 3 pry bars coated in electric tape just to not damage the rim. So we can start with our first pry bar right here. We'll insert it in between the rim and the tire to pull the tire up and out of the rim like this. Now we can take our second, put it on the other side. We can now pull the rest of the tire off of the rim. There we go. Now what we can do is flip the tire on the other side to remove our valve like this. And we can then pull our inner tube we can put this to the side for now. Now what we can do with this is basically push on the tire while pulling the rim out of the cavity, and there you go. Now to reinstall the tire and inner tube onto our rim, we're first going to insert our inner tube into the tire. We can then flip our rim to the other side and insert our valve into the hole right here. We then want to make sure to not pinch the inner tube on the underside of our rim. So we want to push that back in while we insert the tire on the inner tube. Now we want to hold the back side to try and get the rim under the tire. Now that should do it. As you can see, the tire is fully inserted on both sides, and we don't have any inner tube protruding in between the rim and the tire. We can then go ahead and inflate our tire to 36 psi. Now, if you're not sure at what psi you need to inflate your tires, you can always look to the side. Like right here, we can see 36 psi. Now don't be afraid to overfill your tire by a couple PSIs, because when you remove the valve, a little bit of air is going to come out. We can then screw back the valve cap, just like this. Now before we install our wheel, we want to reinstall our drum brake. So first we're going to take our brake line and the arm, put it back in place right here. Then we can take our nut and screw it back in place, just like that. We can then reinsert our brake line into the bracket, like so. Now let's take our wheel and reinsert our drum brake, just like this. When reinstalling the wheel, we want to place the spacers in the proper position. So our smaller spacer right here to my right would be in between the fork and the drum brake, and my larger spacer would go on the other side between the rim and the fork. So we're first going to take our spacer and jam it in between the fork and the drum brake. We can then take our shaft and insert it into our hole while aligning all three pieces, just like so. Now that the shaft is through, we can take our other spacer and insert it on the other side. After we've installed both spacers and our drum brake, we can then take our screw on the other side of the shaft and screw it back in. We can then tighten both screws with our fingers just to make sure they stay in place. Now before we torque our two screws, we want to make sure to align this hole with this bracket on the drum brake. So let's align it properly right here. Then we can take the last screw and insert it right here. Screw it in, and we want to make sure it is fairly tight because this secures our drum brake in place to ensure proper braking. That should do it. Now after we screwed in our top screw, we can then screw in our nut, which is going to be with a 10mm socket. That should do it. We can then take our two 6mm Allen keys and finish torquing down our wheel. That should do it. And as you can see, our wheel spins freely. Now before we remove the wheel, we want to take a 19mm wrench to remove our lug nuts on both sides. So this one will have to go up, just like so. We can keep our lock ring there for the wheel not to fall out. Then we can go on the back side and remove the other lug nut. Make sure to hold the tire when removing the second one, as to not have the tire fall out from under you. Now that we have both lug nuts removed, we can take our lock rings out just like this, and we can then pull the wheel out of the forks. There we go. First side out, and then second side. We can remove our two washers inside the forks, just like this, and make sure to not lose them. What we now have to do is remove the tire from the rim and then pull our inner tube out. Now before we remove the tire, we want to first take all the air out. So we're going to remove the valve cap, just like this. Then I'm just going to take a 4mm Allen key to push all the air out. We can gently push on the tire to make sure the most air is gone. It's going to make it easier to remove the tire. There we go. We can then take one of our crowbars. Of course, it's lined with electrical tape so we don't damage the rim, and insert it in between the rim and the tire. We can then take a second pry bar and gently force the tire off of the rim. There we go. Now we can then push the rim out of the tire just like this, and all we have left is the inner tube. So for this part, we can just push out the valve like so, and now we're ready to install our new tire and inner tube. Now that we have our new tire and new inner tube, we want to insert the inner tube into our tire, just like this. Now we want to install our valve into the hole of the rim. Like so. Now we want to push the tire back into the rim. Now that we've partially installed our tire onto the rim, we want to take one of our pry bars just to put the tire inside of our rim. We can then hold this part right here and go with a second pry bar to get the rim into the tire. Now, this type of tire install can get a little complicated, so just be patient and eventually it will go in just like this. As you can see, both sides are in, so now we can inflate the inner tube and get the tire back on. We can now insert our air pump onto the valve, just like this, and we can fill our tire to 36 psi. There we go. We can now reinsert our valve cap like this. We're now ready to reinstall our wheel onto the scooter. Now before we reinsert the wheel, we want to make sure to put our spacers back in. So this will go inside of the fork, and same thing on the other side. Just like this. We can then reinsert our wheel into the forks. This can get a little tight, so you will need a little bit of patience. That should do it. We can now insert our clip rings right there. Same thing on the back side, and then reinsert our lug nuts on both sides also. We can then take our 19mm wrench and tighten both of our lug nuts. Make sure to hold the fork while you're tightening to not make the scooter flip over or flip backwards. That should do it. And same thing on the other side. And there you go. That's how you change a front tire, a rear tire, and both inner tubes on the Apollo Air Pro.